Hello, glad to see you on the channel. Subscribe, give a like, and don't forget to leave a comment. Enjoy watching.
The HR conference room was the same stale box it had always been. Beige walls, synthetic carpet that smelled vaguely of warm toner, and blinds that hadn't seen a cleaning since the Bush administration. The air was thick with forced neutrality, the kind that makes you feel like you've stepped into a vacuum where real emotion isn't welcome. They'd even laid out the usual unopened bottles of water next to a stack of tissues, as if pretending that some of us might actually cry at being let go. I didn't. I just sat there with my hands folded in my lap, listening to Greg Haskell, my boss for the past 3 years, a man whose leadership style could be best described as PowerPoint dependent. Read from a script someone in legal probably wrote with the same level of passion you'd bring to a parking ticket appeal. He didn't look at me much while he read it. That was typical Greg. He had that way of trying to appear empathetic while simultaneously removing himself emotionally from every situation. It was the same face he used when denying someone's PTO request or pretending to care during annual reviews. The key phrases dropped like bricks: strategic direction, evolving technical landscape, streamlining redundant roles. That last one hit a little harder than the rest. 21 years, and I had become a redundancy, like an old printer no one knows how to connect to anymore. A burden, wrapped in polite language. When he finally reached the end of his carefully prepared monologue, he added a little flourish, probably his own personal touch meant to soften the blow. He leaned forward slightly, tried to smile, and said, "You've been a foundational part of our journey, Alan, but let's be honest, you've outgrown the company, and the company's outgrown you." That was it. The whole performance, finished with one last little insult disguised as insight. I could have stood up and screamed. I could have thrown the water bottle across the room and called him out for every time he had stolen credit for my work or passed me over for promotion in favor of guys who couldn't code their way out of a wet paper bag. But I didn't. Instead, I nodded, slowly, once. Then I said, "Thanks for the clarity, Greg. It'll be useful." I stood up, gathered the folder they had printed for me, complete with a cheerful FAQ about Cobra coverage and a severance package that looked generous on the surface but wouldn't last 6 months, and walked out of that room with the same calm I'd used to debug a crashing server at 2 in the morning during the 2016 infrastructure meltdown. I didn't even bother with a final glance back. What would be the point? I wasn't walking away from something broken. I was being dismissed from something that didn't even know how broken it was. As I made my way to my desk to pack up the last few personal items, I saw him. Troy. 29, maybe 30 if you count the years he probably lied about on his resume. Clean-cut, slim-fit shirt, wearing sneakers that cost more than my first car. He had the confidence of someone who had been told all his life that he was a genius, but had never once been asked to prove it under pressure. He gave me a polite nod, like a young buck acknowledging the old bull as it limps toward the gate. He was already logged in, already typing away on his sleek little laptop with his cloud-native IDE and his third-party plugins. I watched him for a moment, and he looked up, probably sensing my stare, and said, "Hey, just wanted to say, it's been an honor reading through your architecture notes. You really did a lot with what you had." It wasn't an insult, not intentionally, but it still felt like a knife to the ribs. That was the thing with these new guys. They didn't mean harm. They didn't have to. They caused it simply by existing in a world that believed newer was always better. Troy didn't realize that the system he was inheriting wasn't just lines of code and data pipelines. It was a living thing, cobbled together from late nights, emergency patches, undocumented workarounds, and institutional memory that no flowchart could ever fully capture. It was the kind of system that grew like a tree, gnarled, stubborn, sometimes inefficient, but deeply rooted in the soil of experience. I nodded back, gave a small smile, and said, "Good luck, Troy, you're going to need it." He chuckled, thought I was joking. But I wasn't. Before I left, I slipped a flash drive from the bottom drawer of my desk into my pocket. Nothing sensitive, Nothing proprietary. Just one folder labeled in all caps, Legacy Tree. It contained the original logic map from version 1 of the system I had built 17 years ago, plus every key deviation, workaround, emergency patch, and admin-level backdoor I had written and never documented. Not to hide anything, but because when you're the one keeping the lights on, you stop writing everything down. You just know. You become the documentation. That afternoon, I walked out of the building for the last time. The sun was bright, uncomfortably so. I got into my car, turned the ignition, and sat in silence for a full 5 minutes. I wasn't angry, at least not in the way people expect. I was disappointed, sure. Worn out, definitely. But mostly, I felt the weight of something no one in that building seemed to understand. They thought they had replaced me with a faster, shinier model. They thought the new guy had it all figured out because he could deploy containers with a flick of his wrist and talk circles around investors with words like containerized elasticity and microservice synergy. But they had forgotten something simple, something critical. I wrote the original code, every baseline assumption, every quirk, every silent dependency that lived 3 layers down in the system's spine. It all came from Molly. And when someone like Troy starts digging around in unfamiliar soil with the assumption that he knows better than the person who planted the seeds, well, let's just say things can get messy. And as I pulled out of that parking lot, leaving behind 21 years of late nights and quiet victories, I had a feeling they were about to learn that lesson the hard way. Monday morning came in exactly the way I expected it to. Quiet, calm, deceptively ordinary. The kind of morning where the sky is clear and you can almost believe nothing's broken yet. I was sitting at my kitchen table, still in sweatpants, drinking the same burnt coffee I'd been making for the past 20 years, when the first ping landed on my phone. It wasn't a message from anyone I knew, just a push notification from a professional forum where a few of my old coworkers lurked. The subject line was vague, but had that faint whiff of panic. Anyone else having access issues with the back-end API? I refreshed the thread. 3 replies already. All speculative, all confused. I put the mug down, stood up slowly, and walked to my office, what used to be the guest room before my daughter moved out, and Claire insisted I should have a space that's mine. I opened my personal laptop, logged into one of the dev community channels I still had access to, and watched as the digital smoke signals began to rise. By 8:30, half the system was down. Phones weren't working. Internal tools were throwing out authentication errors left and right. Emails from people I hadn't heard from in months began popping up in my inbox. I wasn't even supposed to be getting those anymore. Clearly, someone had forgotten to revoke a few redundant permissions on their way out the door. The subject lines were all variations on the same theme. Urgent. Critical failure. Can you please call me? I didn't. Not yet. I could picture it all without being there. Troy, standing in front of his triple monitor setup with his sleeves rolled up, barking technical jargon he half understood to a room of terrified engineers. Greg, pacing around with his tablet clutched like a shield, muttering about how this was supposed to be the clean handoff phase. And somewhere in that office, a whiteboard still had the words Legacy Refactor Sprint scrawled across it in red dry erase marker, underlined twice for confidence. Here's what happened, or more accurately what I had warned would happen 2 years ago if someone ever tried to rip out the bones of our infrastructure without understanding how the marrow worked. The system they broke wasn't fancy. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't built for TED Talks or demo days. It had been stitched together with layers of necessity, compromise, and ingenuity. What we built was never meant to be pretty. It was meant to survive. And that's exactly why it had lasted. But Troy didn't understand that. He didn't respect the scaffolding. He came in over the weekend, eager to prove his brilliance, and decided to streamline the architecture. From what I could see, through leaked logs, public error messages, and a few loose-lipped engineers in my inbox, he attempted a full rebuild of the identity and access management module. That's the brainstem of the whole thing. You mess with that, You better know what every neuron does and where every reflex lives, or the body shuts down. Troy didn't know. He swapped in some off-the-shelf solution with a fancy UI and limited documentation, probably assuming it would auto-configure with the legacy modules we built a decade ago. Except it didn't. And the moment he ran the deployment script, it overwrote the primary keys, invalidated the authentication tokens, and locked out every endpoint that relied on multi-layered token validation. No one could get in, not HR, not finance, not even engineering. The company's main database went into a protective lockdown mode, something I had personally built after a near breach in 2015, which they obviously never documented because, well, it worked so flawlessly that nobody remembered it was even there. That lockdown mode is smart, aggressive, and deeply unforgiving. It treats any invalid access attempt as a potential breach, especially from root-level commands issued from unrecognized frameworks. The system read Troy's changes as an intrusion and shut itself off from everything: internal dashboards, client-facing portals, batch processing scripts, automated backups. All of it. Dark. And just like that, a billion-dollar logistics firm that handled shipments for half the Fortune 500 was blind. By noon, I'd seen half a dozen panicked LinkedIn posts from staff members, all phrased like riddles to avoid violating NDAs, but unmistakably coded in desperation. One said, "Anyone know how to reinitialize a legacy auth stack in a hybrid cloud environment without live keys?" That was almost poetic in a tragic kind of way. Another posted a meme of a dumpster fire rolling down a hill with the caption, "Day 1 of the Brave New World." I couldn't help but chuckle. Let me be clear, I didn't want them to fail. That's not the kind of man I am. I wasn't sitting in my office rubbing my hands together like some bitter supervillain watching the empire burn. But I wasn't going to lie and pretend it didn't feel affirming. When they called me obsolete, when they said I was in the way of innovation, what they really meant was they didn't want to do the hard work of understanding what I had already built. They wanted fresh paint without fixing the cracks. They wanted faster, shinier, cheaper. What they got was a locked system, a furious client base, and a Monday morning crisis that no one on their sparkling new team knew how to fix. So, I waited. I didn't call. I didn't offer help. I knew it would come. It had to. Not because I had left behind a trap. I hadn't. I'd done everything right. No sabotage, no planted failures. I walked out clean. But the system was too complex to survive arrogance. Troy thought the past was something to discard. He didn't realize it was still holding up the ceiling. And eventually someone was going to have to come crawling back into the basement. By Tuesday morning, the silence broke. Not with a bang, but with a whimper disguised as a carefully worded email. It landed in my inbox at 6:13 a.m., sent from someone whose name I recognized only vaguely, a middle manager in infrastructure operations named Lindsay Foreman, who had always kept her distance from anything resembling friction. The subject line read, "Request for technical consultation, time sensitive," and the body was exactly what you'd expect from someone caught between terror and bureaucracy. It opened with pleasantries that felt pasted in from a template, segued into a vague acknowledgement that recent system challenges had created some disruption, and ended with an open-ended offer for a collaborative engagement, as though we were planning a weekend retreat rather than trying to unstick a digital monolith that was grinding a multinational supply chain into the pavement. I didn't answer immediately. I took my time that morning. I sat on the back deck with a fresh cup of coffee, watching the neighborhood dog try to harass a squirrel out of a tree, and let the absurdity of the moment fully settle in. I had spent over 2 decades inside that company, building the framework they were now flailing to fix, and for most of the last 3 years I had been treated like a formality, like a faded signature on a whiteboard that no one wanted to erase but didn't really want to read either. Now, the same people who once insisted I was too slow, too rigid, too legacy-minded were practically begging me, in corporate speak, to come dig them out of a hole they had eagerly buried themselves in. Around 10:30, my phone rang. No caller ID. I let it go to voicemail. Then it rang again, And again, I answered the third time, if only to hear the tone I knew would be waiting. Panicked calm, that fake kind of composure executives put on when they're trying to convince themselves the house isn't burning while smoke pours from every vent. The voice belonged to Greg Haskell. Of course it did. "Alan," he said, with the same warm tone he once used to coax senior devs into unpaid weekend rollouts. "I hope you're doing well." I didn't reply. I let the silence stretch until he got to the point. "We've had, well, some unexpected issues with the new system deployment, and it's become clear that your experience with the previous architecture could be incredibly valuable during this transitional moment." Transitional moment. That one almost made me laugh out loud. He went on, trying to keep the tone even, respectful, maybe even conciliatory, like none of the past year had happened, like I hadn't been dismissed like a dated manual someone forgot to recycle. He never actually apologized, of course. That would have required more spine than Greg had in his entire suit collection. But he did imply that they needed my help and that they were willing to discuss terms. He used that phrase 3 times in the call, like he was trying to remind himself that I was no longer an employee he could command. I let him talk, then told him I'd think about it. I spent the next few hours drafting a proposal, not out of greed, but because if I was going to walk back into the mess they created, I was going to do it with my own rules, my own protection, and zero tolerance for the same nonsense that got us here in the first place. I laid it out clearly. No formal employment, independent contractor status only, hourly rate that would make an auditor sweat, full remote access, no direct communication with Troy, no meetings unless absolutely necessary, and all work subject to my timeline and discretion. They had 2 hours to accept. They accepted in 27 minutes. They didn't even blink at the rate. That told me everything I needed to know about the level of internal panic they were dealing with. Troy, I assumed, was either hiding in a conference room or being paraded around by PR to assure everyone he remained a valued member of the transformation team. Either way, he was clearly out of the loop, right where he belonged. By late afternoon, I was back inside the system. They gave me a secure VPN tunnel and a stack of scrambled credentials that clearly someone had put together in haste, because I had to reset half of them just to reach the server layer. Once I was in, though, the problem announced itself immediately. Troy had overwritten the core identity module with a containerized identity service that, in theory, was scalable and modern. The problem was, he hadn't integrated it into the deeper logic trees that tied into the legacy access paths, the ones I had built before the company even adopted microservices. He'd broken the root logic flow, and in doing so, triggered the recursive authentication lockout, the one that treats all access, including admin, as a potential threat if certain handshakes fail, which they now did, repeatedly. It was like watching a surgeon replace a spine with titanium rods and forgetting that the nerves still needed to connect. All the strength in the world meant nothing if the brain couldn't send instructions to the limbs. That was the brilliance and the curse of the original system. It was unforgiving, but it was also precise. It did what it was told, and it protected itself ruthlessly. If Troy had actually read the documentation I had written, which, to be fair, was hidden inside a directory named Structure, Montron, Notes Do Not Touch, he might have known better, but he didn't read it. He probably thought it was old junk, not realizing that inside that folder lived every security patch, every override contingency, every logic flow that had evolved through 1,000 late-night fire drills and emergency deployments over nearly 2 decades. I spent the next several hours tracing the breakpoints, mapping the failed calls, and building a bridge that would let us bypass the recursive lock just long enough to reestablish administrative control without triggering a full security freeze. It was tedious, meticulous work, precisely the kind of thing that guys like Troy never had the patience for. But I didn't mind. It felt like visiting an old friend. The system still remembered me, even if the company didn't. And as I watched the access pathways light back up one by one, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in a long time. I wasn't obsolete. I was still the architect, the only one who ever really understood the bones underneath the machine. And now they needed me more than ever. There's a peculiar kind of silence that fills a room when something complex, something monumental, starts working again after days of chaos. It's not the celebratory kind of silence. It's not relief, not at first. It's that quiet exhale that comes when people realize they've been walking along the edge of a cliff without noticing how high up they were until they almost slipped. That was the feeling I imagined filling the offices of Continental Logics at 7:42 p.m. on Tuesday evening, when the final subsystem came back online and the lights on their monitoring dashboards flipped from blood red to cool green one after the other, like dominoes clicking into place. The fix itself wasn't elegant. Elegance hadn't been part of the architecture for years. It was designed to be resilient, not beautiful. I had cobbled the infrastructure together through a combination of necessity, fatigue, and years of pragmatic decisions made at 2 a.m., when the only goal was to keep shipments moving, customer data safe, and auditors off our backs. What I rebuilt wasn't a new system. It was a functional patchwork that spoke to the bones of what was still there, layered carefully so that it played nice with the nonsense Troy had bolted on without thinking through the consequences. I gave them just enough structure to limp back into motion while protecting the integrity of what remained beneath the surface. I didn't tell anyone exactly what I did. That wasn't part of the deal. The contract I had written gave me complete autonomy, and I didn't waste time documenting things for people who hadn't earned the right to understand them. I made notes, sure, clean to the point, with just enough breadcrumb detail to let someone with real experience find their way through. But I wasn't about to gift wrap salvation for the same leadership team that had thrown me out like an expired binder. I sent a summary file, marked it immediate priority, and included the phrase temporary workaround at least 4 times, just to make sure no one got cocky. An hour after the system stabilized, I received a flurry of thank yous. Most were vague, probably written by executive assistants on behalf of the people whose signatures appeared at the bottom. A few were more personal. An old colleague from the integration team sent me a simple "You saved our asses" with a whiskey emoji, which, while technically a violation of company communication policy, felt more honest than anything else that week. I appreciated that one more than any of the form letters. Then came the next part, the part no one really talked about, the internal shift. Not the technical one, but the cultural one, the scramble for blame, the damage control, the rewriting of narrative. Greg, ever the survivalist, issued a company-wide statement the next morning filled with corporate platitudes about unexpected challenges during our modernization initiative and the strength of our team during transitional turbulence. He didn't mention me by name. Of course he didn't. He referred to my work as support from legacy systems advisors, which was the kind of phrase that looks neutral on paper but stings like salt in a wound when you know exactly who earned the credit. Troy was conspicuously absent from the message, and even more conspicuously absent from every internal thread I still had shadow access to. From what I could piece together, he was transitioned into an innovation research role, which is executive speak for put on ice while we decide how to quietly replace you. I wasn't surprised. These guys never get fired in public. They get repositioned, given time to quietly update their resumes, and are eventually shuffled out the back door with a severance package and a glowing LinkedIn farewell post full of cliches about growth and gratitude. What surprised me was the message I received that evening from one of the board members. It was brief, direct, and unsigned, but the implication was clear. They wanted to talk. Not about the system, that part was done, but about the bigger picture, the politics, the way the company had handled the transition, the damage it had done, the cost of losing institutional knowledge under the guise of innovation. It wasn't an apology, not exactly, but it was the closest thing I was likely to get from anyone at that level. I didn't respond right away. I needed time to think. Not about revenge, I'd already taken care of that in my own quiet way, but about what I actually wanted. The system was fixed. The client contracts were safe. The data was secure again. I could walk away, take my check, and disappear. Let the story become company folklore while I spent my days drinking strong coffee and teaching neighborhood kids how to write their first line of real code. But something still itched at the back of my mind. It wasn't just that they had fired me, it was the way they had done it. The assumption that experience had an expiration date, that 20 years of problem solving could be swapped out for a flashy resume and some buzzwords on a PowerPoint slide. They hadn't just dismissed me, they had dismissed the value of everything I'd given them. And that wasn't something I could let go of so easily. So before I logged out for the night, I drafted one final document. It wasn't a technical report, it wasn't a system audit, it was a quiet, unassuming memo addressed to the executive committee and copied to the board liaison. In it, I outlined not just what went wrong, but why it went wrong. The culture of short-sighted leadership, the disregard for frontline input, the dangerous illusion of progress that chases aesthetics over substance. I included names, dates, specific decisions that had led to this point. I didn't editorialize. I let the facts speak for themselves, and I ended the memo with a simple statement. Legacy systems only become dangerous when the people managing them decide that legacy means irrelevant. What failed last week wasn't the system. It was your understanding of it. Then I hit send, not because I expected change, but because they needed to know I was still watching. And because sometimes the most important thing you can do after restoring access is remind the ones who locked you out that you still have the keys. The check cleared on Friday morning, just after 9. And though the number was as satisfying as it was ridiculous, I didn't look at it like a win, not really. It wasn't compensation for work well done, or appreciation for a long career of showing up when others didn't. It was damage control, expensive, calculated, and impersonal. The payment was routed through a temporary vendor portal, attached to a one-line acknowledgement of services rendered, with no fanfare, no signature, and certainly no thank you. That was fine by me. I didn't need a parade. I didn't need Greg Haskell sending a postscript about next steps, or Troy crawling back with a forced apology about miscommunication. What I needed, and what I finally had, was a clean break and the ability to walk away without leaving behind any part of myself still tied to their machines, their policies, or their delusions about how things ought to work in a company built by people they never bothered to understand. That morning, I sat in the same chair I had used to restore their digital backbone, drinking the same coffee in the same chipped mug I'd had since the early 2000s. And for the first time in what felt like years, I didn't feel the weight of unfinished business pressing down on my shoulders. I wasn't bitter. I wasn't smug. I was just done. Not in the defeated sense, but in the way that a craftsman finishes a project and knows, deep down, that there's nothing else to add. I had done what needed to be done, not for them and not even for me entirely, but because the system deserved better than to be gutted by people who didn't know the difference between code that looks clean and code that is clean. They'll move on, of course. That's how companies like that survive. They'll draft new documentation. They'll rebrand the internal tools. They'll tell themselves that the crisis was a necessary pain point on the road to innovation. The ones who stayed silent while I was let go will whisper their opinions a little more confidently now, but only behind closed doors, and only after checking who's listening. Troy will quietly vanish into a lateral promotion or a sideways consulting gig, somewhere with less visibility but equal status, and Greg, if he's smart, will keep his head down long enough to retire before the next storm brews. Nothing will change on the surface, not really, but change was never the point. After finishing my coffee, I opened one final terminal window, tunneled into the root system one last time through the access they hadn't yet revoked, because even now, weeks after the mess was cleaned up, they hadn't learned that when you cut someone loose, you should at least know what parts of the machinery are still listening to their commands. I didn't touch anything. I didn't download a thing. I wasn't interested in sabotage. That was never my game. But there was one last thing I wanted to leave behind. Not a script, not a patch, not even a breadcrumb, but a message. Inside a nested comment section buried in the primary logic module, an area most of their current devs probably wouldn't touch unless something caught fire again, I typed exactly 7 words, just one line, added in silence, saved without fanfare. Legacy isn't code. Legacy is who remembers. I didn't sign it. I didn't date it. I didn't leave a trail. The line would blend into the structure, buried in plain sight, waiting for someone curious or desperate enough to dig deep enough to find it. And maybe, one day, someone would. Maybe not. I logged out, shut down the terminal, and removed the credentials from my keychain. I wiped the last remaining access scripts off my drive, encrypted the personal archive I had maintained over the years, and backed it up to a single offline thumb drive labeled in black Sharpie, mine, not theirs. Then I tucked it in the top drawer of my desk, not because I expected to need it again, but because some things deserve to be kept, even if only to remind you that what you built once mattered, even if it only mattered to you. Later that afternoon, I donated half the check to a nonprofit that runs boot camps for laid-off tech workers over 40. The kind of people who don't show up in glossy recruiting videos, but still carry more knowledge in one tired hand than an entire squad of junior consultants with branded laptops and identical buzzwords. I figured if I was going to be called obsolete, I might as well invest in a world where people like me still get the chance to be useful. Claire found me on the porch that evening, where I was flipping through an old hardcover of Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, not because I was trying to be poetic, but because it reminded me that good systems, whether machines or people, require care, attention, and respect for what came before. She asked if I felt better. I told her I felt finished. She smiled like she understood more than I gave her credit for, and sat down beside me without needing to say anything else. People always assume that revenge has to be loud, dramatic, a final blow struck in front of an audience. But I've come to believe that the best kind of reckoning happens quietly when the world isn't watching. It happens when you refuse to be erased, when you reclaim the version of yourself they tried to overwrite. It happens when the code you wrote outlasts the names of the people who claimed it as their own. And so, I left it behind. Not out of spite, out of peace. I wasn't the villain in their story, even if they needed one. I was the author of the part they forgot to read.